Hey everybody, MP with small field drafts, going back to our roots and doing a 3-team draft on Underdog. It's been a few weeks since we've done a 3-team draft. The ADPs have shifted around a lot. Opening kickoff is fast approaching, and we're probably getting a lot of players who have never played best ball, and we're definitely getting a lot of people who haven't seen a lot of content on 3-team best ball, or probably the cash game sit and go drafts in general. There's a ton of best ball content out there about the tournaments, weekly winners, best ball mania, DraftKings Millie Maker, but there is not a lot of content specifically on these 3-team drafts, and that's what we're here to do today. We want to see how well we can fare. We're sitting in the 3-hole, and we have our first 2 picks coming right up after Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase have gone off the board. Obviously, I pretty clearly want Christian McCaffrey here, and if you've been following my channel at all throughout this offseason, you know I've hardly taken any Travis Kelce at all. However, because we're sitting in the 3-hole here, and I can technically say I didn't take him in the first round, I'm going to challenge myself and draft Travis Kelce at pick number 4. Just as a quick recap, one of the edges that I identified earlier in the offseason with these 3-team drafts was targeting the tight end position, specifically Mark Andrews and the rest of the tier 2/3 tight ends, because their ADP was artificially depressed due to the algorithm not corresponding to these 3-team drafts. The ADP that you see on the screen here actually corresponds to the 12-team drafts, or basically all the drafts that go on Underdog. Therefore, the tight ends were much lower in the queue than they otherwise should have been, and I was drafting not just the tight ends early, I was drafting pretty much all the tight ends that were available on the board. Now, I do know I've been playing best ball in a lot of the tournaments, such as Best Ball Mania, and specifically more so on DraftKings these days, and I have noticed that the tight end ADP has shot up dramatically since early on in this offseason. I mean, you have Darren Waller, who you used to be able to get in the very last round of these 3-team drafts. He has shot up. He's now almost sometimes going ahead of TJ Hawkinson, but we are on the clock once again. 3 more wide receivers and Austin Eckler are off the board. I think we need to fill out our wide receivers. We don't have any, and we want to get as many of the top 10 wide receivers as possible. We're missing out on that tier 1 of wide receivers, but I feel good with both A.J. Brown and CeeDee Lamb. One of the most known pieces of advice for these cash games, cumulative scoring formats, is to target offenses. So if we were, say, doing a 12-team draft that was cumulative scoring, like that these sit and goes are, if you were going to target A.J. Brown, you would then probably want to get Jalen Hurts. You would also want to get Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, etc., because you're making a very concentrated bet on Philadelphia's offense in general. While that sort of exists here in the 3-team drafts, because the player pool is very shallow, you're only drafting the top 55 or so players, you don't really need to do that. Instead, you just want to take the best player on the board. And we are back on the clock. We've had 3 running backs this time go and 1 wide receiver. So we kind of have these end of the wide receiver 1 wide receivers. Tony Pollard, I think, is definitely going to be one of our picks. And sitting here at 16, it's probably a little early to take Mark Andrews. The great thing is that even though his ADP has come up significantly in the regular drafts, he's still pretty buried. So we still should be able to get him around that pick 20 range. And our next pick is going to be 21. So we'll push it here and see if we can wait on Andrews. None of the quarterbacks have gone, so we can wait a while. I don't mind getting Lamar. His ADP has come up a lot. I think we need to go with Devontae Adams here. Garrett Wilson is a guy, if you've been drafting in some of the tournaments, he's fallen a lot, especially over the last month or 2. He had an injury, like an ankle sprain, that took him off the field for a week or so, but he's been back, getting quarterback run here, 3 quarterbacks in a row. Not bothering me because quarterback is the most projectable position. I do think there are some fine workarounds if you don't get one of the tier 1 players. Obviously, I would prefer to have a tier 1 quarterback than not have a tier 1 quarterback. But if I have to spend an arm and a leg in order to get them, in my opinion, it's not quite worth it. Now, we do have an interesting decision here. Lamar Jackson is one of the last players I consider to fit in that quarterback 1 tier, but Garrett Wilson is still on the board. We only have 3 wide receivers. You have to start 3 on a weekly basis. And then obviously if a wide receiver fits into your flex, they are going to be, I think what we do is we go Garrett Wilson and Lamar Jackson. Because of the fact that we took Travis Kelce with our second pick, usually here I would go Andrews. In fact, pretty much every time I would go Andrews here at pick 22, because more than likely he's going to get taken in this next block, and we're not going to get him back at 27. He just went at 25. But because I have Kelce, I still want to draft multiple elite tight ends, just to, if nothing else, to bully our opponents out of getting them, removing the valuable tight ends from the queue. Yeah, Darren Waller shot up a lot here. And I'm going to go instead with Lamar Jackson. So in this case, I'm going with getting that elite upside at quarterback instead of that elite upside at tight end, because we already have that elite tight end upside filled in. We only have 4 wide receivers, but they are all in the top 10 according to ADP. We do still have a couple of running backs here. Now, this again is kind of the end of a tier. I think we're going to let me take Josh Jacobs here with our first pick, because he's one I know I want for sure. Do we want Chris Olave? Is he worth betting on? I think Calvin Ridley. In these cumulative formats, usually what you're going for is a floor rather than a ceiling necessarily. But who's going to project for more points straight up? The number 1 wide receiver in Jacksonville's offense, who we project to take a step forward, or the number 1 receiver in New Orleans offense, who has the weakest schedule of any team this year by a pretty wide margin? I decided I was going to go with Calvin Ridley. Now, I remember also back when we started drafting earlier in the offseason, Calvin Ridley was a guy you could get several rounds later, but that doesn't matter. These sit-and-go drafts, they're their own contained structure. Closing line value doesn't matter at all, so just push that out of your head if that's what you're used to in drafting Best Ball Mania. We don't need to worry about closing value. Each draft is its own contained draft, and we can worry about our exposure. We don't have to think about exposures or anything. We just want to focus on winning this one particular draft. This room is very interesting with Ball Dunker and Shady 45. Shout out to both y'all out there. Pretty much just taking the value that they're getting at every single pick for the most part. Nobody is doing anything crazy. Sometimes, especially in these 3-team drafts, some people have some wild strategies. But everyone just seems to be picking from the top of the board. There's no more wide receivers here that I really love. I think we're pretty much done, maybe until our last pick there. I do think TJ Hawkinson is going to be a lock for one of our picks. And then the next question is Jahmyr Gibbs or Travis Etienne. I like the idea of, again, thinking about floor rather than ceiling. Travis Etienne definitely projects, in my opinion, for a higher floor than Jahmyr Gibbs. And that does correlate with our Calvin Ridley. Going back to one of the things we talked about earlier in the video, we could probably set ourselves up with a Trevor Lawrence stack to fill in that QB2 position. We might have to think about that coming up here, or we say, hang on, Justin Fields, he's still in the queue. And these quarterbacks with huge rushing upside, especially when you're looking at your quarterback 2 position, when you drafted a tier 1 quarterback, you're expecting them to make your lineup a large percentage of the time. And your second drafted quarterback should really only fit in your lineup when they have a spike week. And obviously those spike weeks come more often and much larger at the hands of these elite rushing quarterbacks, specifically Lamar Jackson and Justin Fields. A great duo here, just without thinking about anything else, is Jahmyr Gibbs and Justin Fields. That just kind of blows you away when you're talking about your quarterback 2 and your running back 5. Again, this tier of wide receivers is very flat in my opinion. Jahmyr Gibbs, you can just see it here on the queue. Take these visual cues when you're drafting. Jahmyr Gibbs is at the end of a tier himself. as the running back 10. I kind of like that cutoff. I want as many wide receivers in the top 10 as possible and as many running backs in their positional top 10 tier as possible. At quarterback, we want to narrow that down to the top 5 or so. And I think Justin Fields, we're talking about ceiling, how it doesn't matter quite as much. But at the quarterback position, because of the fact that rushing dominates the scoring so much, I think we have to go with break our correlation, break the stack. We might still have a chance if we want to and take Trevor Lawrence. We're pretty, you could say that if the draft ended now, we would have just as good a team as if it continues on for the next 3 or 4 rounds. Because these guys that you're drafting here are much less likely to ever make our starting lineups. And so the last 4 or 5 picks in these 3-team drafts are more or less luxury picks. And what do you want to do with those luxury picks is a question that we should be asking ourselves quite a lot, because it does matter, in my opinion. So my usual strategy pretty much here has kind of come apart and blown up. I am only getting 2 of the top, 6 tight ends. I do think Dallas Goedert should be considered a cut above the next grouping. Dallas Goedert belongs more so with the tier 3 tight ends, let's call them. So I'm definitely hinging on him. Najee Harris has some sneaky value in these 3-team drafts. We definitely don't need to think about quarterback now until our very last pick, if we even want to go there. The only reason we're thinking about it is because both Lamar and Justin Fields have a week 13 bye. Kind of important, although it's not going to kill you. You're missing out on maybe 17, 18 points guaranteed. Now, what's going to be the difference between the top scoring team and the second place team in most of these small field drafts? It's probably going to be more than that, although I don't have any data on that. I would love to know. There's nobody here I'm really seeing except Najee Harris. He's pretty much, even at this point in round 16, at pick 46, we don't need a running back 6. And honestly, I don't love taking 6 running backs regardless. But in the situation where everything else is relatively flat, Najee Harris, in my opinion, does seem to be a priority option. Now, I do like a lot of these guys, Aaron Jones, Kenneth Walker's definitely. Aaron Jones, I think, actually is really good in this format. Man, dealing with these updated ADPs has definitely pushed up the tight ends. We didn't get to hammer them. We didn't start hammering them maybe as early as we otherwise usually would have. But our opponents seem to be on top of taking tight ends. And so now pivoting into a strategy, more so again using these luxury picks, I like to use them offensively and try and sink my opponents rather than necessarily help my team. Because again, I'm assuming that most of these picks aren't going to do much for our roster. Definitely not tight end. Wide receiver over running back, just structurally speaking, I think yes. We're going to be starting on average 1 more wide receiver over running back on a weekly basis. And we do have a stack lining up right here with Amari Cooper and Deshaun Watson just to fill in that quarterback. We're going to spend that luxury pick on a low yielding bond just to give us a little bit of safety in the Deshaun Watson. Obviously, there's some questions about him, but as our QB3, I think it's not a bad idea. We come away with a 3-6-6-3 team, a palindrome draft. I do want to compare and maybe now tinker a little bit with what our strategy should have been. I'm thinking that we maybe took too many running backs. Definitely. I would have probably, if I knew then what I know now, I would have avoided Josh Jacobs and Travis Etienne entirely. Gone a little bit harder into my tight end bully. And then picked up, some of these guys Kenneth Walker, I love, and it's just like I'm shrugging my shoulders, going, he's not even drafted in this format. Like Kenneth Walker, I think is a really good pick here, and even a bunch of these other running backs, they project to probably be pretty stable. And how much of a difference is there really between Josh Jacobs, Travis Etienne, Jahmyr Gibbs, Najee Harris, and some of these guys? Obviously, if we go on ADP, the difference is whatever the difference is in ADP. But again, the ADP is not specifically tailored to this format. So the market is not efficient, to say the least. Let's check out kind of after action report here. Go over our team: Lamar Jackson, Justin Fields, Deshaun Watson. We have a great balance of floor and upside, really tilted to the upside. I love that. More capital than I'm usually willing to spend, but 18th round pick in a 3-team draft is basically no capital investment at all. Relatively speaking, I bet you will have the lowest quarterback investment invested, I would guess, for the similar amount of return that our opponents are getting. Running back, 6 of them. We have Christian McCaffrey, Tony Pollard, Josh Jacobs, Travis Etienne, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Najee Harris. When you draft a guy like Christian McCaffrey, you're penciling him in pretty much every week that you know he's going to be starting and finishes a whole game or plays most of a game. He's going to be in there. That's what you're betting on anyway. And it's a really good bet. Just begs the question, how many more running backs do you need after that point? So it gives you, we go from having like 4 luxury picks, like say, at the back half of our draft, to now we have 5. Or if it's 5 luxury picks that you normally have, now we have 6. What do you do with that extra luxury pick? And I like to use it offensively. I think that's how I should proceed. If I get Christian McCaffrey, I definitely don't need 6 running backs. I took Najee Harris just because my tight ends were all gone. There was like nothing else I could do. So it's not like, oh, you shouldn't have taken Najee Harris. I wouldn't have if there was somebody else I liked. What I'm thinking now instead is I shouldn't have taken Josh Jacobs. I probably shouldn't have taken Travis Etienne. If I knew I was going to get Jahmyr Gibbs, go with 3 running backs and Christian McCaffrey, Tony Pollard, Jahmyr Gibbs, give you that blend of floor and upside. That way we could really invest in our tight end strategy. Go for maybe an earlier wide receiver. Not necessarily, because Amari Cooper's there at pick 51. Calvin Ridley's a guy like I want to have those wide receiver picks in the top 20. Pretty much Garrett Wilson will be the last guy that I want to be drafting. Maybe Calvin Ridley belongs in there as well. So we get like the first 30 or so picks to get our wide receivers in. That's usually then where I want to be investing in tight end at the very beginning of the offseason. That's where we were hitting these running backs. But their ADP is kind of settled. Some of them have moved up, some of them have moved down. It's a little wonky. So maybe next time, we'll see how it goes. We'll spend less capital if we get Christian McCaffrey or Austin Eckler, my top tier running back. Spend less capital overall at running back. Spend more of those picks in the 30 to 40 range on tight end. Make sure we get our tier 1 quarterback if we can, but late, going with Lamar. Hitting as many top 10 wide receivers as we can, and then getting all the tight ends. I like having Kelsey, Hawkinson, and Goddard. It's a great tight end stable. None of the other 2 opponents are going to have better tight end room than us. George Kittle, Darren Waller, and Pat Freiermuth being one example. With Ball Dunker, Shady, he's got Andrews, Pitts, and Dulcich. I definitely don't like that room. Dulcich is nothing. Spent a lot of capital at quarterback with Mahomes, Allen, Herbert, and Lawrence. I mean, that's a lot of picks. He's probably detrimental to his team because you're only starting 1 quarterback per week. Eckler, Robinson, Taylor, Madison, Jones. Eckler and Robinson, obviously a great duo. Jonathan Taylor, there's questions about him right now, and like it's existential questions. It's not, is he going to be a 50% running back? Is he even going to play at all this year? So that's not a floor play. All right, and at pick 24, that's relatively high investment capital. That's like where he was going 2 months ago before any of this stuff was up in the air. Alexander Madison and Aaron Jones, those are fine running backs. So I'd just say get rid of Jonathan Taylor. I don't think he's worth it, especially not at that price in these formats. Again, there's no closing line value that you have to worry about. Each draft is its own contest. Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Chris Olave, Devontae Smith, DK Metcalf. Great room. 3 wide receivers in the top 10, in my opinion. 3 in the top 15 or so. So he's okay, just way too much investment at quarterback. I think he's probably the odd man out of this race. Hurts and Burrow, awesome combo. Running back, Nick Chubb, Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Ramondre Stevenson, Joe Mixon. This is a type of running back room that I would be drafting 2 months ago, but instead of paying these like 11, 14, 20, I was getting them like 30s. Or maybe the back half of the 20s. So not to say, again, that doesn't necessarily matter because of closing line value, but I just think that's so much capital to be spending when I think I could better spend it somewhere else. Although looking at his wide receivers, you can see why he then felt he needed to load up on running backs, because he's going, man, I'm so good with Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, and Stephon Diggs. I can just bank on them week in and week out. I really want to have an elite running back room as well, soak up all the top running backs finishes. And then George Kittle, Darren Waller, Pat Freiermuth, like that's a great tight end room. Again, it's just not as good as ours. So he's got a top tier quarterback room. He's got a top tier tight end room, but not the top like we are. He's got a top tier wide receiver room, and he's got a top tier running back room. This ball dunker's got it going on. So ball dunker, I think, is our main competition. Shady, I think, is left out in the cold. Maybe going to be paying the rake for this battle. That's why I like these small team drafts. You can get a large amount of volume in. There is still some strategy, and it's not as widely discussed. So if you got any ideas, let me know. And you can play a little bit more offensively in these larger field drafts. You just got to sit back and collect and do what you can do for yourself. I like taking punches at other people, especially in these 3-team drafts that only cost $3. A lot of times, going to get people who've never played any best ball at all. Although sometimes I wonder if having just listening to like best ball Twitter, so much talk about Best Ball Mania and the big field tournaments that it's almost like people aren't even playing the same game. Anyway, MP from Small Field Drafts here. Come back for another video soon.